700 North Korean special forces have landed in Burkina Faso. Sounds like fake news on social media, but this is real. And they didn't come for training. They're not UN observers, and definitely not a humanitarian aid team. They came armed, on a real mission, to protect a president being hunted by enemies within his own military. Ibrahim Traoré, once hailed as the young captain of Africa's new liberation movement, is now the target of assassination plots, coup attempts, and unseen hands reaching in from the outside. But why North Korea? A country isolated, sanctioned, with no clear economic interests in West Africa, yet willing to send 700 of its elite commandos to a distant continent just to protect a young military leader? Could this be a sign of a new global power order quietly taking shape? A rising alliance of sanctioned nations pushing back against the West, from Moscow to Pyongyang, and now Ouagadougou. And here's the question no one dares to ask out loud. Is Africa becoming the underground battleground of a new Cold War? One where the West didn't get an invite? In today's video, we're going behind the scenes of this shocking event to explore. Why did Traoré choose North Korea? What's really happening inside Burkina Faso's new security system? And is this just the beginning of a power axis that could replace Western influence across Africa? But first, there's one detail no one's talking about, and it just might make you rethink the entire global power map from a whole new perspective. A country in West Africa, a dictatorship in East Asia, over 12,000 kilometers apart, and yet now they stand side by side on the same front line. No welcoming ceremony, no flags waving, just 700 North Korean special forces, armed, equipped with military-grade communication systems and urban warfare tactics, quietly landing at Ouagadougou Airport. This isn't speculation. Burkina Faso's Ministry of Defense confirmed it. North Korea's state media didn't deny it. Satellite images have even captured temporary military camps being set up near radar stations in the north. But the real shock isn't in the number. It's in the strategic meaning behind their arrival. Because in modern history, North Korea has never deployed elite troops beyond the Korean peninsula, except in covert, unconfirmed intelligence missions. But this time, they showed up publicly at the official request of the host government and were granted the highest level of operational authority to protect the head of state. The U.S. once sent special forces to protect the Afghan president, but under the NATO flag, with hundreds of oversight conditions. France has protected many African leaders, but always retained political leverage. But North Korea? They don't interfere in politics. They just protect. And that's exactly why they were chosen. A senior intelligence officer in Burkina Faso, speaking anonymously, said, "We don't need advice. We need people who don't flinch when staring down a gun." And North Korea answered that call with the one thing they do best: ironclad discipline, ultra-secretive internal protection systems, and the ability to neutralize a threat before a single shot is fired. In a world fractured by interests and ideology, sometimes what you need to survive isn't friends, but allies who ask no questions. But one question still lingers. Why now? Why did Burkina Faso choose this exact moment? And why is North Korea's presence not a reaction, but part of a plan quietly set in motion long ago? Up next, we'll uncover the hidden pieces behind the fog, the backroom negotiations, the covert drills, and the real reason why this isn't some unusual move, but the opening step in a long-term strategy to rebuild a national security system under siege from all sides. No strategy ever begins with gunfire. Every landing, if it's effective, is just the visible part of a much deeper hidden plan. When 700 North Korean special forces touched down in Burkina Faso, the world called it a surprise move. But the truth is, there was nothing surprising about it. According to diplomatic sources, The deployment had been quietly prepared over nearly 3 months, across 4 undisclosed diplomatic meetings between representatives of Burkina Faso and North Korea. Held at the North Korean embassy in Addis Ababa, a covert military facility in Eritrea, and most notably a closed-door meeting in Moscow, with Russian officials present. During that time, temporary infrastructure for the special forces had already been built near the capital. A separate eavesdrop-proof communication network was provided and installed by North Korea before the troops arrived. A list of internal weaknesses within Burkina Faso's military, including double-dealing officers, had been filtered using a system known as loyalty scoring, the same system North Korea uses to safeguard the inner circle of the Kim regime. A leaked example from Russian intelligence. An Air Force colonel stationed in Kaya, reportedly a key figure in a previous coup plot, voluntarily retired just 1 week before the North Korean forces landed. No investigation, no media buzz, no trace left behind. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a preemptive purge of the security pipeline before the system got rewired. Why does this matter? Because if you look at the history of Western military interventions, you'll notice a recurring pattern. Rushed entry, chaotic withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. In those places, boots hit the ground first, but intel, infrastructure, and public trust either came too late or never came at all. North Korea is different. They don't land to conquer. They land to lock down. Lock down internal leaks. Lock down access points. Lock down opportunities for enemies to strike. When a hunted regime no longer trusts anyone, they don't need loud help. They need a human firewall. And North Korea has become that firewall. No Wi-Fi required, no explanation given. But this preparation isn't just tactical. It lays the foundation for something far bigger. A North Korean-style defense system. Not just soldiers on guard, but a full architecture of internal control, from data to personnel, to the emotional pulse of the military. That's what we'll uncover next. As we dive into how North Korea didn't just send soldiers, they sent a leadership protection strategy sharpened over 70 years of survival. North Korea doesn't have Google, no Netflix, no Facebook, but they have one thing that even global superpowers are still struggling to master: an internal security system nearly impossible to break. If the Western world believes in transparency, rule of law, and democratizing the armed forces, North Korea builds its power on 3 pillars: absolute loyalty, peer surveillance, and tiered information control. And when their special forces arrived in Burkina Faso, they didn't just bring weapons. They brought a survival manual from a regime that has outlived dozens of coup attempts and decades of global sanctions. So what's in the Pyongyang playbook? 1. Multi-layered loyalty system. Every unit doesn't just have a commander, it also has a loyalty officer, whose sole task is to independently report any suspicious attitude, words, or behavior from within the group. In Burkina Faso, this model is now being trained within President Traoré's personal guard. Each group of 5 soldiers includes a shadow unit leader, whose rank is kept hidden, but who has access to personal data and the authority to temporarily isolate team members showing risk indicators. 2. Compartmentalization of intelligence. In North Korea, no single person, not even high-ranking generals, has access to complete information. Data is sliced and layered, only reassembled in one centralized hub under direct control of the supreme leader. This model is being piloted at Burkina Faso's Military Command Center in Ouagadougou, where provincial-level reports must pass through at least 3 layers of filtering before reaching Traoré's desk. 3rd. Ideological hardening. North Korean soldiers aren't trained to defend some abstract concept of the nation. They are programmed to protect the leader above their own lives. In Burkina Faso, similar emergency ideological drills have been integrated into elite training programs, with one core message repeated over and over. If the president lives, the nation survives. If he falls, the nation falls. At a northern base, a Burkina Faso officer was removed from the protection detail just 6 hours after the internal AI system detected an unusual recording device in his personal phone. No public statement, no trial. Transferred overnight. This is no longer old-school security. This is preemptive root removal. No reporting needed. A modern security system doesn't need to be open to be effective. It needs just one thing, the ability to self-purge before it leaks. So, why would a country like Burkina Faso, young in its politics and still developing its democracy, willingly embed such an extreme control model from East Asia into its core system? The answer lies in a harsh truth. Burkina Faso doesn't need democracy right now. It needs survival. And in the Sahel, where there have been 8 coups in just 3 years, you don't survive by counting votes. You survive by building a team that won't betray you. Burkina Faso is no longer just a country. It's a testing ground for coups, for betrayal, for failed Western strategies, and now for an Eastern alliance. In less than 36 months, Burkina Faso has witnessed 2 consecutive military coups, toppling 2 presidents. And the man now sitting in the seat of power, Captain Traoré, is the very one who led the most recent uprising. Here's the problem. When you seize power through the barrel of a gun, someone else can take it from you the same way. Why does Traoré need more than just Russia? Russia can offer weapons, mercenaries, and surveillance drones. But Russia doesn't have a proven internal power protection model, because they too have faced coups, betrayal, and embedded espionage. North Korea, on the other hand, they've preserved a father-to-son leadership line for over 70 years, surrounded by sanctions, plots, and enemies. They didn't just survive. They gained total control over every link in the command chain, and that's exactly what Traoré needs most right now. The dangerous reality in Burkina Faso, a report from the Africa Center for Strategic Studies states, over 70% of field-grade officers in Burkina Faso have direct or indirect connections with at least one foreign political interest group. 2 coup attempts were uncovered in 2023. Both shared the same pattern. Use of encrypted apps like Signal and Telegram infiltration of military communications units, and most critically, none of the plotters were exposed internally. It was only after a Russian unit noticed suspicious civilian drone activity that red flags were raised. This means Russia is only a second-line filter. The first line, internal prevention, remains completely compromised. At a training base near Koudougou, 3 recruits were found using fake IDs. All 3 passed the military's internal security checks and were only flagged after North Korean AI models detected anomalies in their speech patterns. No one inside the military questioned them. No one double-checked their transfer history. The system was already clinically dead from the inside. When an army is fragmented by competing interests, and officers aren't even sure whose side their superiors are on, everything, from army bases to the presidential palace, becomes a potential battlefield. You can't fight enemies at the border if you don't know who in your own ranks will pull the trigger first. And that's why, despite having Russia Wagner and UAVs, Traoré still invited North Korea into the very core of his power structure, not as a sponsor, but as an architect. Modern warfare is no longer about trenches or missiles. It's about power structures, alliance maps, and the question, who is being protected, and by whom? Burkina Faso, a small, landlocked country with just over 20 million people, has unexpectedly become the center of a new axis of power. Not because it's rich, not because it's strong, but because it's weak, and is redefining how a weak nation can survive. Why has this place become a power laboratory? Because in this tiny geographic space, global fault lines converge. Anti-Western sentiment is surging. The military is deeply fractured. Public trust in imported democratic models has collapsed. And critically, it lies in the Sahel region, dubbed by the UN as the Triangle of Death, due to its mix of terrorism, smuggling, and ethnic conflict. What do global powers see here? Russia sees an opportunity to expand influence through Wagner and light weapons. Iran sees a market for drones and surveillance tech. China is quietly expanding digital infrastructure through shell companies. North Korea? They see a blank slate, a place where an entire security system, from fundamentals to command architecture, can be rebuilt from scratch. In the past 90 days in Burkina Faso, over 12 tactical training centers modeled on North Korean doctrine have been set up. A separate military telecom system that bypasses all Western networks has gone live in 3 strategic provinces. And for the first time ever, local special forces are now using a Pyongyang-developed internal communication OS, previously used only in North Korea's capital. This country has become a live testing ground for North Korea's anti-espionage-style security framework. When you're abandoned or strangled by Western aid conditions, you begin learning how to build your own survival weapons. Burkina Faso no longer begs, no longer explains. They test, fail, adapt, and rebuild from within. But here's the danger, and why global powers are watching so closely. If this experiment works, it could become the template for dozens of other nations across Africa. The real question is no longer, will Traoré survive? But rather, if he survives and stabilizes the country using this model, how many others will follow? It's no coincidence the world is starting to call Ibrahim Traoré a mini Thomas Sankara. But if Sankara was a revolutionary dreamer, Traoré is a survival engineer navigating a political battlefield full of ticking time bombs. Traoré didn't rise through elections. He didn't appear at international forums. And he didn't graduate from Western political institutions. He is the product of accumulated disappointment and smoldering frustration within Burkina Faso's youth. A generation that was promised democracy, but got unemployment, terrorism, and corruption instead. So why has Traoré become a new symbol of anti-Western resistance? 1. He doesn't ask for aid. He rejects it. In his first 100 days in power, Traoré canceled at least 5 aid packages from the EU, France, and the World Bank, totaling over $300 million. When questioned, he simply said, "If money comes with the condition that I give up control of my own country, then I don't need it." 2. He doesn't meet with the G7, he meets with the sanctioned. Instead of flying to Brussels or Davos, Traoré held closed-door meetings with military envoys from Russia, North Korea, and Iran. A leaked French intelligence report described him as a dangerous leader because he doesn't need international recognition to claim legitimacy. 3. He doesn't practice diplomacy. He picks sides. In a speech in Ouagadougou, Traoré declared, "If I must choose between dangerous freedom and stability brought by others, I'll take the danger, as long as I control it." In October 2023, Traoré ordered the expulsion of all French military advisors within 72 hours, stating, "We don't need observers anymore. It's time to act for ourselves." Just 1 week later, a shipment of military-grade telecommunications equipment from Pyongyang landed quietly. No press, no cameras, no official statement. This is diplomacy by defiance. In a world dominated by institutions, alliances, and international conferences, survivors aren't necessarily the ones with the most allies, but the ones who dare to say, "I don't need you." And to countries like Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea, Traoré has become an ideal role model. But more importantly, Traoré's rejection is not isolated. It's fueling a new wave of resistance across Africa, where young leaders are beginning to realize you don't need Paris to survive, you don't need the IMF to grow, and you don't need Washington to be legitimate. If you can't use the dollar, use gold. If the global banks shut you out, trade off the grid. In a world of sanctions, financial blockades, and exclusion from SWIFT and international payment systems, countries like North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, and now Burkina Faso are building a shadow trade network, one that's highly effective and built on humanity's oldest foundation, barter, the direct exchange of goods. So what does Burkina Faso bring to the table? Gold. One of Africa's top gold producers with over 150 tons of untapped reserves. Uranium, enough to catch the attention of any nation with military or energy ambitions. Rare earths and strategic minerals, critical for producing tech, weapons, and electronics. The very things China, Russia, and North Korea all lack. And Traoré has one advantage his predecessors never dared to use, leveraging natural resources to buy survival. No IMF, no World Bank, no signatures from Paris. Here's how barter diplomacy works. Precious metals from Burkina Faso, military equipment, comms systems, radar tech from Pyongyang, raw uranium, intel advisors and data surveillance systems from Moscow, rare earths, and limited mining rights. Localized digital infrastructure from Beijing, no public contracts, no bank invoices, no traceable financial records through Western systems. Only one-on-one deals between nations pushed to the margins of globalization. In January 2024, a North Korean military tech team arrived in Burkina Faso and installed 3 tactical positioning systems independent of U.S. GPS networks. Just days later, a Burkina transport plane flew to Eritrea, carrying unregistered refined gold bars. No news outlet reported it. No foreign government condemned it. Because no one can prove anything. And no one wants to expose a model that might spread. When you can't play by the world's rules, you build your own game board and only invite those like you to sit at the table. Barter diplomacy may seem primitive, but in today's fractured world, it's becoming the most powerful weapon for nations locked out of the old system. And if you think this is just a Burkina Faso phenomenon, think again. This model is quietly being replicated by the AES, Alliance of Sahel States in Niger and Mali, where every gold bar doesn't just buy weapons. It buys freedom from the global institutions that once controlled an entire continent. If you can't trade in London, go to Ouagadougou. If you can't open an account in New York, go to Niamey. And if you can't sign treaties in Geneva, do it in the shadows, in Africa. While Western powers build their foreign policy around ever-growing sanctions lists, something else is quietly taking shape beyond the radar. Shadow diplomacy. Silent alliances between nations branded as sanctioned, authoritarian, or untrustworthy. And at the center of it all is Africa, a continent redefining what it means to be an international partner. No longer relying on institutions like the IMF, World Bank, or European Union, a wave of new African governments is opening an alternative path, direct alignment with the very countries the West has spent decades trying to silence. Why is Africa so attractive to sanctioned nations? Strategic open space. Africa remains the only continent where most strategic borders aren't controlled by NATO or U.S. intelligence satellites. Untapped resources, gold, uranium, cobalt, rare earths. These nations don't need profit. They need to trade those assets for survival. Governments open to restructuring. Countries like Guinea, Mali, Sudan, and Burkina Faso are in transitional phases, moments where new political operating systems can be installed from the first line of code. In November 2023, an Iranian technical team landed in Mali under the label of agricultural consultants, but they brought with them UAV jamming tech, short-range radar systems, and military advisors previously active in Yemen. At the same time, a secret deal was signed in Bangui, Central African Republic. North Korea would provide cybersecurity infrastructure for the Ministry of Defense in exchange for 5-year mining rights to rare earth deposits. No Western outlet covered it. No press conferences were held. Just a handful of excluded nations quietly building a new game, with no referees, no spectators, and no permission asked. Isolation doesn't kill a country. Isolation simply forces it to find new friends, who are also isolated. And when there are enough of them, they stop being exceptions. They become a system. Africa, once forced to adopt foreign development models, is now becoming the chessboard for nations rewriting the rules. Not to fight the West, but to prove you can survive and even rise after the world turns its back on you. An army can lose a battle, but an army without loyalty will collapse a nation from within. When Traoré took power, the first thing he did wasn't to buy more guns. It was to change who held them. Because he knew the one who pulls the trigger on the next president is likely already standing in today's security detail. So how did Burkina Faso restructure from within? 1. Loyalty profiling. With help from North Korean security experts, the Traoré government launched a system that analyzed behavioral patterns and operational history of every officer. They didn't just look at service records, they reviewed mobile data, encrypted communication history, and interactions with foreign entities. Even those who merely leaned suspiciously, without proven betrayal, were quietly reassigned from strategic posts. In just 90 days, over 130 officers were silently replaced. No investigation, no press, just removed from the chain of command. 2. Train loyalty like you train marksmanship. New Presidential Guard units were required to undergo specialized loyalty training, led directly by North Korean commanders. Every day included anti-subversion drills, simulated coup attempts, loyalty tests when tempted by treasonous superiors, and response protocols if family members were taken hostage. The goal wasn't to win battles, it was to create unshakable minds. No hesitation, no doubts, no second thoughts. A leaked internal training video showed recruits placed in mock interrogation rooms, forced to choose between loyalty to the president or saving their loved ones. And only one answer was accepted: no negotiation. 3. Dual chain of command, overt and shadow chains. In addition to the official chain of command, Burkina Faso implemented a shadow command network where loyalty alone determines who receives orders. No public titles. No visible ranks. Only codes, encrypted messages, and results. This model replicates North Korea's secretive command architecture, where every officer is unknowingly monitored by an invisible parallel system. You don't need a massive army to protect a country. You need an army that doesn't waver when you're weak, doesn't betray you when you're wrong, and doesn't sell you out when you're being hunted. Burkina Faso is building exactly that. Not through democratic doctrine, but through the logic of survival. An army not meant to conquer, but to prevent the bleeding from within. And what's more concerning, This model is now being replicated in Niger and Mali, where even younger commanders than Traoré are starting to build their militaries like bomb shelters, sealed, secure, and merciless. Every alliance is born from a shared fear. NATO was born out of fear of the Soviet Union. The EU was born out of fear of another war. And the AES, the Alliance of Sahel States, was born out of the fear of being abandoned and overthrown from within. When Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger announced their withdrawal from ECOWAS, the West-backed regional economic bloc, the Western world saw it as a reckless move. But in the Sahel, it marked the beginning of true independence. Not independence on paper, but armed independence, intelligence independence, and freedom from remote-controlled, democratic oversight. So what is AES, the Alliance of Sahel States? No central bank, no joint parliament, no shared flag. Only one binding principle. If one member is attacked, from within or outside, all others will treat it as a common enemy. Why is AES so alarming to the West? Because it doesn't operate under international law, but under survival instinct. AES doesn't negotiate based on aid programs. They act based on intelligence and real power leverage. They don't ask permission to restructure their militaries. They learn from each other. Training manuals from Burkina Faso are being translated into Hausa and Bambara for use in military camps across Niger and Mali. They don't rely on NATO. They connect with sanctioned nations. Advisors from Russia, telecom experts from North Korea, and UAV technology from Iran are now operating quietly throughout the Sahel. In March 2024, the three AES countries held a joint covert military exercise, codenamed Sahel Shield, simulating an incursion by foreign mercenaries. The drills used independent communication systems, no Western GPS, no 3G networks. At the end of the exercise, an encrypted message was circulated internally. From now on, if a bullet is fired in Niamey, its echo will be heard in Ouagadougou and Bamako simultaneously. An alliance doesn't need a budget, bureaucracy, or long treaties. It only needs a shared fear and a vow to leave no one behind. AES is proving that when you can no longer trust the old system, you rewrite the rules and find teammates in the same fight. And that's exactly what makes AES the West's new nightmare in Africa. Uncontrolled, financially independent, not asking permission to exist, a NATO for the sanctioned, an EU for the blockaded, a defense pact born not from summits, but from survival. At first they laughed, then they criticized. Now, they're holding emergency meetings. When Burkina Faso expelled French forces, when Mali announced its withdrawal from ECOWAS, when Niger signed a UAV deal with Iran without notifying the UN, the West's initial response was a wave of arrogant condemnation. Undemocratic, irresponsible, against the progress of globalization. They thought a few tough statements and some financial sanctions would make the AES countries back down. But what they didn't expect was the resilience that comes from having nothing left to lose. And just as these self-reliant, self-defensive, no-aid-needed models started showing real results, the West realized. This is no longer a temporary disruption. It's a new strategy. 3 clear signs the West is panicking. 1. Washington forms a Special Africa Task Force with 0 African voices. In March 2024, the U.S. National Security Council created an emergency group to assess the threat of the AES bloc and the influence of Russia-North Korea in the Sahel. Yet not a single independent African expert was invited. A familiar reflex, analyzing Africa without asking Africa. 2. France launches a re-engagement media campaign. All talk, no action. The French Foreign Ministry spent over 20 million euros funding TV programs documentaries, and social media campaigns about the Franco-African friendship. Meanwhile, no actual initiatives were deployed to support rural communities still suffering from terrorism. They talk about trust, but AES is building defense systems, not diplomatic consensus. 3. The EU adds AES to its geopolitical risk watch list, but avoids public sanctions because they know sanctions don't work on those who don't play by the rules. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have already ditched the euro, abandoned SWIFT, and rejected Western aid. They now rely on direct resource-based transactions and logistics networks from other sanctioned nations. While the U.S. State Department warns that the presence of Russian paramilitary forces is a regional threat, AES representatives were, at the same time, in a closed-door meeting in Algiers, negotiating new trade routes through Algeria and Mauritania, bypassing all Western-controlled ports. While the West criticizes, AES is redrawing the transport map. When you underestimate an opponent, you're not just wrong, you become a victim of your own complacency. The West once believed that a lack of money, technology, or global standing would force countries like Burkina Faso into submission. They were wrong, because what AES doesn't lack is the will to survive without permission. And the most troubling part for the West isn't a momentary loss of control. It's that a model they once dismissed is becoming the blueprint others are beginning to follow. When a leader tightens control over the military, they call it a dictatorship. When a Western leader does the same, they call it national security. So, who really gets to define legitimacy? One of the harshest criticisms from the West toward the AES model, particularly Burkina Faso, is that these military governments are turning themselves into authoritarian fortresses under the banner of sovereignty. And the most common question is cooperating with North Korea, Russia, and Iran pushing African countries into a cycle of total control, eliminating all dissenting voices? It's not an easy question, but it needs to be asked in the right context. 1. When democracy fails to protect civilians, before Traoré came to power, Burkina Faso had a legitimately elected government. Yet in just 12 months, over 2,000 civilians were killed by terrorist groups, dozens of villages fell under armed control, and the military was not allowed to respond without diplomatic approval. So who is truly authoritarian? A system that forbids self-defense, or a government that decides to defend itself at all costs? 2. When military cooperation becomes a political tool. Yes, North Korea's model is not democratic, but their security experts are training forces to be loyal, incorruptible, and unshakable, something the West has never successfully achieved in Africa. Russia doesn't care about democracy indexes, but they also don't demand electoral reform in exchange for weapons. This gives AES leaders something they've never had before: the freedom to design state structures based on practical needs, not foreign-imposed templates. In Mali, after cutting EU aid and expelling French advisors, the government implemented an early warning system based on grassroots data and a local network of information fighters. Terrorist incidents dropped by 28% in 6 months, a result Western-backed programs have never delivered. But when asked about democratic standards, the government replied, "We haven't held elections yet, but our people can finally sleep through the night." While the West focuses on democratic procedure, many African nations are now focused on governance outcomes. Security first, democracy later. Or more accurately, democracy cannot exist if the state itself does not survive. Of course, the risks are real. Absolute power can lead to abuse. But we must also ask, how can any model be judged fairly when the West is always the one writing the rules and holding the measuring stick? Maybe instead of asking, Is AES becoming authoritarian? We should be asking, has the world ever given them another option, without political strings attached? For nearly a century, security in Africa was a service provided, not a right exercised. Want to defend yourself? You had to ask permission. Want to buy weapons? You needed approval. Want to train your army? You needed international observers. But today, that era has ended. For the first time since the continent's independence, African nations are redrawing their own security boundaries, without needing a stamp from Paris, Brussels, or Washington. Why is this moment so pivotal? Because for decades, security wasn't something African nations could establish freely. Every defensive measure, from purchasing military hardware and hiring advisors to launching counterattacks, had to pass through a Western donor approval process. Want to buy radar? You had to prove it wouldn't be used to suppress opposition. Want to build special forces? UN representatives had to oversee the training. Want to fight back against terrorism? You had to follow NATO-approved humanitarian protocols. The result? A continent that technically had sovereignty, but no real right to defend itself on the ground. But that has changed, and it began with a simple decision. We will no longer ask for permission. Undeniable examples. 1. Burkina Faso, banning all international security observers. All observer missions from the EU, UN, and the US were suspended indefinitely in late 2023. A statement from the president's office read, "No one outside this country has the right to decide how we survive." 2. Niger, launching a top-secret rapid response force without international notification. The Black Echo unit, composed of special forces trained by Russian and Iranian advisors, was activated covertly to prevent internal coup plots. Not a single Western nation was informed of its existence. 3. Mali, developing an isolated military communication network. With help from North Korean engineers, Mali now operates a fully internal military network, cut off from global fiber optic lines and invisible to Western satellites. This eliminates the risk of mission leaks or data interception. When you depend on a system, you have to follow its rules. But when you build your own, you don't need permission to survive, and you don't need validation to exist. This is the end of monopoly. The monopoly on defining stability, the monopoly on labeling who is legitimate, the monopoly on deciding who deserves protection and who doesn't. And now that AES, along with new allies like North Korea, Russia, and Iran, are offering full-spectrum alternatives in security weapons, intelligence training. Digital infrastructure Africa is no longer a client being controlled. It's a decision-maker choosing its own providers. Burkina Faso was once just a tiny dot on the global map. Today it's a model, a prototype, a living experiment, quietly watched by the world. When people used to mention Burkina Faso, they referred to one of the poorest, most unstable, landlocked countries on Earth, plagued by coups and terrorism. But in just 18 months, this nation has become the center of a new military alliance, a strategic partner to 3 of the world's most heavily sanctioned states, and most importantly, the first country to successfully pilot a national security model independent of the West. Why is Burkina Faso being called a global prototype? Because for the first time, we are seeing a full sequence, from A to Z. 1. A leader rises without elections, but earns support through action. Traoré was not elected, but he reclaimed territory from terrorist groups, rebuilt the army, and restored public faith in the country's ability to defend itself. 2. A government rejects all international institutions, yet secures new strategic partners. Rather than isolate itself from the world, Burkina Faso shifted alliances toward the East, where partners don't demand reforms in exchange for aid. 3. A country with no advanced tech, no independent central bank, still builds parallel systems for security, command, and payments. With help from Russia, North Korea, and Iran, Burkina Faso has launched its own military communications network, traded gold for radar, uranium for drones, and operates a defense system fully detached from NATO or the EU. A final real-world example. At the end of April 2024, the Burkina Faso government held a closed-door strategy summit with representatives from Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Sudan. The internal name of the meeting, the Replication Summit, a 64-page document titled Defense Autonomy Blueprint, a Post-Dependency Defense Model for Africa, was shared. This is no longer just a national strategy, it's a replicable model for any nation seeking control over its own destiny. Some will call Traoré a dictator, others will hail him as a liberator. But what can't be denied is this. In complete isolation, Burkina Faso has achieved what decades of global aid systems have failed to do: turn a fragile state into a nation that can defend and decide for itself. When small nations learn to survive without permission, great empires begin to fear, not because they lose allies, but because they lose the power to decide who is friend and who is foe. Burkina Faso is no longer just a national story. It is a signal, a warning, a new blueprint for a world turning away from monopoly. Burkina Faso didn't ask for permission to exist. They simply existed and forced the world to reconsider everything. A country with no overwhelming natural resources, no independent central bank, no geostrategic value in the eyes of the West. Yet it possesses something many superpowers are starting to lose: the ability to rebuild a power structure from ruins. They don't just defend themselves, they've redesigned foreign policy, restructured internal systems, rejected foreign aid, built their own alliances, and turned every so-called disadvantage into the foundation of a post-colonial defense model. This is no longer just a nation. It's a blueprint, a prototype for every place once labeled weak, dependent, incapable of sovereignty. And now the question is no longer about Burkina Faso. The question is about you. If you're a citizen of a small country, surrounded by debt, imposed policies, and endless support meetings, would you dare to step outside the system? Do you believe another path is possible? If you support the AES-style model of autonomy, comment, "No permission needed." If you still believe in reform within the global system, comment, "Change the system, not escape it." And remember, the story doesn't end with Burkina Faso. Next, we'll take you to Mali, Niger, Guinea, then on to Sudan and Ethiopia, where this wave is rising day by day. Because this is no longer about who's right or wrong, it's about who will survive when the old rules collapse. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and get ready for the next chapter. Because if you think this is the end, you haven't heard about the second one.